So we've got a full agenda for you today. We have kind of a special guest today. We have Liza DeGenring, who is a PhD candidate at UNH. She is in ag science, and she's here to talk about what is Chitosan and how can it be used in tree fruit production for disease management. And so this is just kind of a sneak peek at a presentation that she's going to be doing for us at our New Hampshire Tree Fruit Growers Association coming up in April. But just so you get an idea about what she's working on and a little bit of background information. And very fitting that both she and Carrie are on today because they've been working together a little bit on this. So with that, Liza, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you to share your screen and take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. As Jeremy said, my name is Liza DeGenring. I'm a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire in the Poleatewich plant pathology lab. And today is just a really small teaser on my research with the natural product Chitosan and how it can be used in tree fruit production for disease management. So what is Chitosan? It is a derivative of chitin. Chitin is the second most abundant carbohydrate behind cellulose. And this is because chitin is found in the exoskeleton of insects, shells of crustaceans, and in fungal cell walls. So in our commercial industry, chitin is taken from the waste of the seafood industry. So it is taken from crab shells and things like that, and it's ground up to create the powder chitin. And then Chitosan is derived from chitin, and we predominantly use Chitosan because it is more soluble in water than chitin. And as most of you know, it is very important to be able to have something in solution to be able to apply it in an agricultural setting. There are products that are currently being used commercially in the United States or that are coming to market. And these are two of the products that I've been using in my research. Armorzen is created by the company Bacterial, and TidalGrow is created by the company Tidal Vision. It's also important to note that there are a lot of other commercial international Chitosan products that have yet to be able to be regulated by the United States, and so then has not been able to be used yet commercially here. So what is Chitosan's use in apple disease management? A lot of the research with Chitosan in agriculture has looked at its use as a post-harvest application with many different fruits and vegetables. And what we found is that Chitosan can prevent storage rot and can extend shelf life. And this is predominantly because Chitosan creates a nice barrier around a fruit or vegetable that can slow the ripening process and can also reduce weight loss because of moisture loss. And that film on the fruit actually can prevent fungal or bacterial pathogens from penetrating the fruit. And there's a lot of research to suggest that Chitosan can actually directly be antagonistic toward the fungal or bacterial pathogen. So that's another mode of action. And for our research, we're looking predominantly at Chitosan for prevention of blue mold and bitter rot. And so here's an example of our research that we've done where this is an apple that we treated with a water control, and then we inoculated it with a Penicillium expansum, which is the causal agent of blue mold. And this is the whole lesion size. So this is not a yellow apple. This is the lesion after 14 days. Where this apple was treated with Chitosan and then inoculated Penicillium, and you can see there's a dramatic difference between the lesion sizes. So that's really exciting for us. But this research is pretty well established. We're just confirming it in an apple production setting. And so most of my research is focused on pre-harvest application of Chitosan because there's much less research in that area. What is there has said that it can improve plant health and it can also reduce disease in a very similar way as a post-harvest application, where you would spray it on the plant and it would create a nice barrier between the leaf and any immature fruit to prevent any fungal pathogen from attacking. There's also some research that suggests that it can have, create an enhanced plant defense mechanism, which is another mode of action. We are predominantly working with apple scab to examine how chitosan can be used in tree fruit production, but we're also looking at powdery mildew, rust, fly speck, and sooty blotch. And like I said, this is just a really quick teaser, but as Jeremy mentioned, you can come hear much more at the New Hampshire Fruit Growers Association annual meeting on April 7th, where I'll be talking about more in depth on my research and our results for examining synergisms of biopesticides and natural products for disease management and tree fruit production. And it was really serendipitous that I was asked to come for this talk because Carrie Peter is one of my collaborators, and much of my research so far has been done at her Penn State research orchard. This is where that picture was taken from. And so all of that data will be reported to you at this talk on April 7th. I'm also trying to establish some on-farm trials in New Hampshire this summer. So if you're interested in that, or if you're interested in any information that I've talked about, feel free to email me. My email is listed, and also a lot more information about my research and myself is on my website, which you can find on this QR code. So thank you for your time, and I'll hand it over to Kari Peter.
All right, thank you, Liza. That was great, and looking forward to hearing more in April. Thank you very much. And it wasn't totally by chance that we invited you to be here today with Carrie. It worked out great that you could both do it on the same day. So thank you again for being here. All right, and so our next speaker is Dr. Carrie Peter. Many of you probably know Carrie. She's an associate professor in tree fruit pathology at Penn State University. Her expertise are in apple and pear diseases, peach, cherry, and other stone fruit disorders. And areas of interest for Carrie are diseases of pome and stone fruit, especially bacterial diseases, and post-harvest apple rots. So Carrie, with that, thank you again very much for being here and presenting on this to us. As you know, we did have some issues here in New Hampshire with trying to kind of differentiate between copper toxicity and bacterial issues last year. And so really glad that you could be here to kind of help set the record straight and help us better understand what we're looking at. With that, Carrie, I'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. So yeah, I appreciate everyone who has come out to, this as far as today, because it's a nice day here in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure people should want to be pruning. So glad that folks have come out to hear about copper use in controlling bacterial spot. And also I'll briefly mention some other strategies as well to control other bacterial diseases as well. So first, what we're covering today is we're going to be talking first about copper and understanding copper as a bactericide. And then we'll talk about its use in controlling bacterial diseases on cherries, like sweet cherries predominantly, and also on peaches and nectarines to control bacterial spot. So the blossom blast, bacterial canker problems that often wreak havoc in the spring, and then as far as those persistent issues of bacterial spot on leaves and fruit later in the season. So first, we're going to talk about copper and understand the ins and outs, because there are lots of coppers out there that have a lot of different claims. And so I want folks to be armed with information so they can vet these products, appropriately, as opposed to just sort of taking things in and basically taking stuff at their word. So basically, we're going to cover how copper works, the factors that impact the efficacy of copper sprays, and then finally, copper injury, as far as how phytotoxicity occurs, why pH matters, and the do's and don'ts of using copper to limit injury. And an FYI here, one thing I want to come as far as tell you right off the base is that all copper products, to a degree, can cause injury on peach and nectarine trees. Now, you may hear about products saying, oh, this doesn't cause phytotoxicity. Well, if it wasn't tested on peach and nectarines, they usually always cause some kind of phytotoxicity. But we do see, as far as degrees of phytotoxicity, depending on it's depending on the cultivar. But I just want to say that right up front, because I know the products out there and I know the claims that I'm hearing. So I just want to kind of address that immediately. So first, as far as how does copper work? So copper is a general biocide. So what does that mean? It is a product that non-selectively targets, anything, and it kills it. So whether that's a plant cell, a fungal cell, or bacterial cell, it acts as a protectant when it's used as a fungicide or bactericide treatment. And so consequently, it needs to be applied before the infection occurs. So that fungal cell or that bacterial cell needs to see that copper particle on the plant tissue in order for that copper to work. There's no post-infection activity like some of your other translaminar fungicides you may use for like apple scab. Copper sticks where it hits, and then there's not going to be any redistribution after an application, much like you could see for other fungicides that, the more it rains, the more you get it distributed on the leaf surface or the fruit surface. That's not the case with copper. It sticks where it hits. So while on the leaf, copper requires moisture to be present in order for copper to be active. And that's because that's where the release of the copper ions come from. The water interacts with the copper, especially when it's a copper particle, and ions are released. When those ions are released, that's what's doing all the heavy lifting in killing fungal cells, bacterial cells, and unfortunately plant cells too. And so consequently, copper is going to be most effective on the diseases that require some kind of free water present in order to develop, like bacterial spot on peach. And then as far as how the copper ions are really controlling fungal or bacterial pathogens, is that these ions are destroying critical enzymes that are important for cell functions, for the fungi to survive and for the bacteria to survive. So the take-home message here is that it's the copper ions, which you can't see with the naked eye, that's doing all of the control mechanisms for managing disease. So as far as the challenge here when working with copper products is that you want to have the copper ions present in order to kill your target of interest, whether it's fungi or bacteria, while keeping that concentration low enough to avoid or limit copper injury on plants. Because remember, copper is a general biocide. It's going to kill plant cells to a degree, depending on the concentration and formulation. So in order to limit copper injury as much as possible, you want to use copper products that are relatively insoluble in water. So when we talk about solubility of copper products, we need to talk about what is soluble copper products versus insoluble copper products. So soluble copper products are products like bluestone. If you know Bordeaux, like the Bordeaux mixture is usually bluestone and lime together. And so bluestone, when you add water, it is a soluble copper, meaning all the copper ions are present there all at once. And so if you put basically a formulation, a soluble formulation on the plant leaf, and you have water present, all the ions are there all at once. Unfortunately, whatever ions are there, if you get a hard rain, it will be washed off. But the copper ions are going to be doing what they're doing wherever they hit on that leaf. So if they're hitting a fungal cell, they'll kill the fungal cell. The bacteria, they'll kill the bacteria cell. And it will also kill plants as far as plant cells too, because it's a general biocide. Now, this is in contrast to low soluble coppers or insoluble coppers. These are our fixed coppers. So what does it mean by a fixed copper? So what a fixed copper is actually a copper particle that has the copper ions attached to it. And then as you have rain or wetness that it's applied, those ions are gradually released. So that's what's different. That's how it's different than a soluble copper, where all the ions are available all at once. Soluble coppers, the ions are gradually released from those copper particles. So when you're spraying a solution of an insoluble copper, you're spraying a suspension of copper particles, and those particles can persist on the leaves. And so as the leaf gets wet, more copper ions are going to release. And then if you apply more copper, you will have, more copper particles there, more ions released. And so with each event of water being applied to the leaf, you'll have more copper ions present. So consequently, you'll get a residual type of protection when you use an insoluble copper. So again, just as far as a cartoon visual, you have water present, and then you have your copper particles present. You have a few ions that pop up. More water is applied, you've got more ions. So you've got this gradual release of copper ions. So that's how insoluble coppers or fixed coppers tend to be, quote unquote, a little more safer, because you don't have all those ions ready to go and going to kill what's ever there. You just have this gradual, as far as gradual release of ions. So they're there when they're needed, if you want to think of it that way. Now, as far as soluble or insoluble coppers go, or fixed coppers, they aren't all created equal. So here is a depiction. So I'll walk you through this. So let's first look at the center line here, the center arrow. So this is sort of as far as a range of solubility in water of fixed coppers. So copper hydroxide is more soluble in water. It's still a fixed copper, but it's more soluble in water. So there's more, more ability of the copper ions to be released, readily from that insoluble copper, from that fixed copper. In contrast to something like basic copper sulfate or cuprous oxide, which is less soluble in water. So again, it's probably going to take more water to be able to release those ions. But again, these are all fixed coppers, and then copper oxychloride is kind of right in the middle there. Now, when we talk about like Bordeaux mixture, when you're adding lime, you're binding up copper ions with the lime and making it fixed. So that's why why people liked using Bordeaux in the past, is because it tempered the release of those copper ions from that soluble copper. So when you mix that soluble copper with the lime, it tempers that soluble copper, and it acts like a fixed copper, where you have more of a gradual release of those copper ions. Now, copper products that are 100% soluble in water, soluble coppers, this is bluestone. And also copper sulfate pentahydrate, which is also known, you may know the trade versions as Mastercop or Magnabond. These are soluble coppers. These are coppers where the copper ions are all there ready to go. So, and the other thing is that you can actually temper, soluble coppers, as I mentioned, by adding lime. And so basically you can make it fixed. Now, not all coppers are blue. Now, we automatically think that copper is blue. Well, there's actually different colored coppers out there. And Nordox is actually rusty colored. So this is a type of fixed copper that is not blue. It's actually rusty colored. And so the other thing to know is that, there's lots of copper names out there. We've got copper hydroxide, copper oxychloride, basic copper sulfate, copper sulfate. Well, it's important to know that basic copper sulfate and copper sulfate are two different copper products. Basic copper sulfate is a fixed copper. Copper sulfate is a soluble copper. So copper sulfate is copper sulfate pentahydrate. So it's very important that, like, when you're hearing all these different terms, just to make sure that you know, like, what is soluble and what's not soluble. Okay, so as far as what makes a good copper effective, so there's different components or different parameters. And one of those parameters is the percent of metallic copper in the formulation. So you can have all different types of formulations. You can have aqueous liquids, you can have flowable liquids, you can have wettable granules, you can have wettable powders. And so you can have all different types of formulations. And they will have either active ingredient, which is a type of copper, as far as what the percent active ingredient is, But really what's most important to you for your information when you're making decisions about copper and what to put on and how much is the percent of metallic copper per unit in that product. So for instance, Quava. Quava is considered a soft copper soap. And the reason why is that it has a very low rate metallic copper rate, 1.8%. Well, what does that mean? It means that there is 0.018 pounds of copper per gallon of basically product. So that's a really low rate of copper. So you wouldn't use Quava as a dormant spray because that is just wicked low. You would have to put on a ton of copper during a ton of Quava in order to get some kind of effective amount to control during the dormant period. Now, in contrast to something like Nordox, which is 75% metallic copper, that means there's 0.75 pounds of metallic copper per unit of Nordox. In this case, it is it's a solid product, so 0.7 pounds per pound of Nordox. So there's a lot more copper in that. So that's why when you're looking, and this is all on the label, so you want to be focusing on the percent metallic copper. So, and as you can see, all the metallic coppers are very different based on products. Now, if we look at something like Master Cop, which is a soluble product, you'll see the percent metallic copper being pretty low. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of copper in there. You have to remember that this is a soluble copper. So that 5.4% of metallic copper, that is 100% copper ions there. That's a lot. You've got a lot of active ingredients there of percent metallic copper. Then on the label, it specifically tells you as far as how many pounds of copper there are per unit of that product. And I don't know that off the top of my head, but I know it's pretty high. So this is important that to really pay attention to the labels when you're looking at this, because one, coppers aren't created equal as far as their formulation. There's different copper products out there as far as their active ingredients goes. The percent of active ingredient is important, but what is just as important is the percent of metallic copper. And really, the more percent metallic copper you put on something, the more disease control you're going to get. However, the more phytotoxicity you will also get as a result. So we're going to come back to this when we talk about bacterial spot control, because this percent metallic copper is going to be your best friend when you're making decisions as far as what copper to use for bacterial spot control and how much to put on.
Hey, Carrie.
Yes.
Just real quickly, there was a question about where does cuprofix fall on that chart?
Cuprofix.
And someone added it was 40% metallic copper.
Yes. Okay, so it's 40. So it's 40%. So there's 0.4 pounds of cuprofix per pound of units, or I should say per its unit. So I mean, it's up there with the COSI. So, okay. And then also, and one thing I should have had here is we have the Penn State Tree Fruit Production Guide, and I have a table of all the coppers that are labeled for tree fruit in this guide. And also I can forward that table to Jeremy, and he can also send this out, or maybe tag it to whatever you guys post this information to give you, just to give you another resource, because I include all that information as far as percent metallic copper and what the unit is and stuff like that. So
thank you, Carrie.
Were there any other questions before I move on?
I think that's basically it for right now.
Okay, great. Okay, so the other determining factor that's important for efficacy is particle size. And so the copper particle size, it's determined by how finely that copper has been ground. And you can't determine this looking at a product, folks. I mean, this is something that it's on the micron size, not the naked eye size. And so large particles, these can be easily moved by wind or rain. And so here's a nice little cartoon of two leaves here, which shows you as far as how large particles would look on a leaf versus small particles. So with small particles, the more small particles per pound of product you have better spray coverage, because you'll get better deposition and sort of more uniform deposition on the leaf. This will adhere to the plant surface better. There's a longer residual activity because you'll have a lot of particles that are releasing copper ions over a period of time, as opposed to large, sort of blotches on the leaf that, that was only going to be affecting that area where those particles are hitting. So it's just something to be aware of. And going back to this slide that I had before, I added the particle size to it. Now, some of them I couldn't find the particle size to, but I'm assuming it's pretty small. So for instance, Quava, I couldn't find the size, but I know that it is fairly small. But something like Nordox is 1 micron in size. Master Cop and Copper Count N, these are not particles because they're soluble, because you're just spraying the ions. And if I did some digging as far as Master Cop and Magnabond, and then when they talk about particle size, they're talking about the granule size of the product itself, because this is like it looks like a bluestone material that you add water and then, it gets soluble. Although in these types of cases, I believe these are already liquid. But the starting material of sort of the granule is a certain size, but that's not what they're talking about. They're actually talking about, in this case, the actual particle that is part of that copper, that fixed copper solution, and how big it is. So for instance, Coside is on the slightly bigger side. Champ Flowable is in the middle there. New Cop and COC, they're, everything's still on the smaller side here. So I don't think you can go wrong based on particle size, but it's just something to be aware of as far as just understanding how copper products work, because there's a lot of factors involved in efficacy, and also how companies make these products too, as far as what they're looking at as well. Okay, as far as do's and don'ts to minimize copper injury, one thing you need to really kind of solidify in your head is that soluble fixed coppers, their phytotoxicity increases under acidic conditions. Meaning, if your water is not already neutral at pH 7, say you have water that's relatively acidic, and say it's well water that's relatively acidic, you would want to do something to kind of bring up that solution. And I'll show you a slide in a minute as far as like the pHs of copper aren't all created equal. And also being mindful of what you're adding to your spray tank. So it's also a good idea to be mindful of what the pH of your spray tank is too. When you're using a copper and knowing that it increases its phytotoxicity under acidic conditions, you don't want to be adding any adjuvants that make it acidic, like Li 700. Preferably, I don't want to have any adjuvants added to copper, because I feel like you might be playing with fire, because you don't want anything to be penetrating or working any better than it has to, because when it does, it means it's going to be killing plant cells. Another thing to be mindful of is adding something to your copper that, again, will allow it to better penetrate, like adjuvants or something like a foliar fertilizer. What you're seeing in this picture is an example of basically someone who used a foliar fertilizer, then added copper, saw copper injury thinking it was bacterial spot, added more copper, added more foliar fertilizer, and next thing you know, it's a Christmas tree without any leaves. It's basically all we see are peaches. So, acidic conditions or anything that allows that copper to really penetrate the tissue really well will cause phytotoxicity and premature defoliation. So you need to be really mindful as far as your spray solution goes. And so other products that offer good penetration are those phosphorus acid products like Rampart and Fostrol and Profite. I'm focusing on those products. I'm working with a phosphite right now that is different, but I'm not even going to go into that story. But I can tell you with these ones for certain, you do not want to be mixing or mingling copper with these products, because these products already want to penetrate. That's what they're designed to do, to really penetrate. So if you mix these with copper, they will pull that copper into the plant cell, and then you'll get damage. And then unfortunately, you may also get premature defoliation as a result of that severe damage of phytotoxicity. So again, take home message: spray solution of the pH of your spray solution in your tank be careful of what you're tank mixing with your copper, preferably that you're not tank mixing anything that allows for better penetration. Okay, so as far as the pH, spending some time about pH and appreciating pH. So we did like a little experiment in my lab to just get a better idea of understanding what's just the natural pH of some of these copper products when it's in our water. And so the water that we use to mix up our spray solutions is around 7. When we add Quava, it drops it a little bit to like 6.52. Quava plus double nickel doesn't really alter the pH all that much. There was some talk years ago about double nickel safening Quava. Double nickel really doesn't alter the pH any much. But if you add lime to that, it increases the pH, and then you do get less phytotoxicity. But you got to be careful about anything with a really basic pH in your spray tank, especially when you're spraying with insecticides, because insecticides do not like alkaline pHs. So, you know, that's just as far as keeping that in mind. Master Cop, that soluble copper, that copper sulfate pentahydrate, 5.99, that's acidic. Master Cop and lime, it bumps it up as far as the pH, and you kind of have a fixed solution there. Coside, surprisingly, by itself is 7.52. And then Cooper Fix Ultra is around 7.34. Now, so for a few seasons in a row, I noticed on my peach trees a lot more phytotoxicity with Quava than with Coside. And I was really curious because Coside, they claim this is a safer copper. Well, now I understand why I was seeing more phytotoxicity, is that Quava is slightly more acidic than Coside. And this would explain why I was seeing differences in phytotoxicity in the field. So it would be a good idea to know what your pH is, and then doing like a jar test and just seeing what the spray solution is, just so you know, especially if you're seeing kind of really unusual or unexpected phytotoxicity if you didn't anticipate it. So you know, when it comes to peaches, ironically, Coside seems to be one of the safer ones that I've tested. I haven't tested Cooper Fix Ultra, and I think it's because of that temperament of the pH at around 7 or slightly above. So again, it was an interesting observation. Okay, so again, revisiting the do's and don'ts. Another thing you need to be mindful of are slow drying conditions. So in the summer, if you've got frequent wetting events and you've got copper on those leaves, anticipate that you're going to have copper ions being released on leaves that have already had copper applied to them. Now you may see, especially older leaves on peach trees, that may defoliate a little bit more. Well, that's because that, you know, it's, you know, the copper is being applied. If it's being applied repeatedly, those older leaves are going to take a beating, because you're just going to have copper layer on top of copper layer on top of copper layer, and then you'll see the youngest leaves look great. So just be mindful of that's the reason why you see differences in phytotoxicity on peach trees, is because you've got layering of copper that is being applied. But you know, one thing is that if it's a really wet season, you don't want to be applying copper all the time. You want to be actually really judicious about when you're applying copper to use it as a disease management tool. Now, but during the winter, late dormancy, it is okay and perfectly safe to tank mix oil with your dormant copper spray. It's actually recommended. You'll get some residual control as far as that copper sticking around, and also, you know, as far as better penetration and stuff with that oil. But that is the only time you want to be adding oil to trees is during this time, is during the dormancy period. So just something to be mindful of.
While we have a little break here, Melanie Ivy had a question. It was, is this based on 100 gallons per acre? But I'm not sure. Melanie, do you want to unmute, or are you able to unmute and just clarify your question?
Hi, Carrie. I
Melanie.
was just wondering, for your pH test, you had the rate per acre.
Yes.
Was that based on 100 gallons?
Yeah, we were using it, based on 100 gallons. So we adjusted accordingly. So it was just a small jar test in the lab, but we based it on yeah, what would be applied with 100 gallons to the acre.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Carrie, back to you.
Okay, all right. So, and the answer is true. Acidic spray solutions will increase the phytotoxicity of copper. So now we're shifting gears to bacterial blast or blossom blast, bacterial canker blossom blast. Now, this disease is considered a cold weather disease because it really only shows up during those crazy springs when things have pushed, it was warm, and then it gets really cold and frosty, and then we see kind of, you know, things going crazy in stone fruit orchards, especially if they're in bloom. So we're going to just quickly discuss predisposing factors, the symptoms, the disease cycle, and ultimately management. Okay, so a big predisposing factor for bacterial canker and for blossom blast, these two diseases go hand in hand because it's the same pathogen, essentially. It's a Pseudomonas syringae, and it's, you know, var syringae, and it's another type of Pseudomonas syringae. It seems that, you know, this disease likes sandy clay soils. It likes it when the trees are a little stressed, whether it's due to nutrient deficiency or high ring nematode populations. Winter pruning is something that promotes this. Severe winter freezes and spring freezes. And the reason why I put in spring freezes in a different color is because this is where we see this bacteria wreak havoc. And the reason why is that the bacteria have special proteins called ice nucleation proteins. And what these proteins do is that when they're present in the plant cell, they allow the plant cell to freeze at a higher temperature than it would normally do if those proteins weren't there. So plant cells can be super cold, so they can withstand like 28 degrees without any problems. But if these pathogens are there and this bacteria is there with this protein, they can freeze like at 31, 32 degrees. And when that happens, you get, you know, it's sort of busting of the plant cells. The bacteria will feed on all those nutrients that are oozing out, and then you see evidence of the disease, whether it is dead blossoms or oozing from the tree, cankers and such like that. So that is all basically the result of the bacteria taking advantage of, you know, the damage that it had inflicted on the tree. So this is an example of blossom blast on sweet cherry. This occurred a couple years ago, basically, you know, 2020. It was like, you know, this was, you know, one other things that were on the 2020 bingo card was a spring freeze, which led to a lot of blossom blast on several stone fruits. So this was on cherry. This was also on cherry, as you can see. You know, this was all the cherry blossoms that were completely taken out. I saw apricot trees look similar, peach trees the same way. Also on apple trees too. It just kind of was, it really wreaked havoc that year. And so this is just kind of an up close. But I will say this is I'll mention something in a minute, but one thing is that I wasn't too concerned for this grower because we see the blossom blast here, the dead blossom, but the infection didn't move into the wood. So the years where the infection would move into the wood, then you need to worry. In this case, the tree was going to recover because it didn't penetrate into the wood, and it just was going to look unsightly that year. So they were not going to have any cherries in this one orchard, but it's when it's a severe infection and it moves into the wood and it can turn into bacterial canker, then that's when we have to really worry. Again, another example. So as far as how to prevent blossom blast, because this is like the first stage of bacterial canker getting a foothold in the tree. One thing is that you need to be monitoring disease conditions. Okay, so if your trees are blooming and it's calling for frosty temperatures, you want to get out there the day before those frosty temperatures occur because you need to manage that bacterial population in those blossoms. There's two ways you can do it. So in all stone fruit, you can apply copper. Now, if you use copper, you need to time it like before the event because the bacteria will repopulate those blossoms rather quickly. So you don't want to be spraying on a Monday and the frost event's on a Thursday. It's not going to help you. On cherry trees, they've recently labeled Kisumin for cherry, so you can spray it at bloom time. This will help as far as buying you some time because Kisumin, you know, it will suppress the bacterial population in that blossom and limit the death of that blossom. And you can do that probably a day or two, prior. You don't have to be as rigid as like copper application. So for stone fruit folks, if you've got cherries, cassumin is an option. Copper is also an option. For all stone fruit, copper is your only option for everything else other than cherry. Okay, so as far as other symptoms of bacterial canker, we saw what basically blossom blast, which is the blossom phase of bacterial canker. That's how you could look at it. On fruit, this can be sporadic. The fruit can have like a chocolate color to it, water-soaked lesions. You may or may not see it. Where you really see it are in the leaves and the wood. So in the leaves, I've really noticed it a lot in leaves where you'll see shot hole appearance. You may see chlorotic rings, lesions along the leaf margin. You'll see curling as you can see here in this middle leaf picture. This is a side-by-side picture of basically the bacterial canker pathogen on sweet cherry leaves and then cherry leaf spot on tart cherry leaves. Now, you need to know the difference between these two because one's a fungal disease, one's bacteria, and you may say, it's the same disease. It's not. So again, bacterial diseases, it has that, shot hole appearance, kind of the speckling, the leaves are chewed up. Where there's a little more, I feel like I say rhyme or reason to cherry leaf spot on tart cherry trees, where you'll see dark lesions and they'll follow the veins of the leaf oftentimes. Those lesions may fall out, but they can be clustered. But it looks, as you can see, very different between the two of them. The bacteria almost looks like it's like something had sprayed, as far as, something got on the leaf and it created all these little holes, where this is, the fungus sort of takes a much more methodical approach how it's infecting. At least that's how I visualize it. So just be aware if you have sour cherry trees and sweet cherry trees, that there are two different diseases. That's not to say that sour cherry trees can't get bacterial canker. They certainly can, and they can look just like these leaves. But sour cherry trees are very, very prone to cherry leaf spot, which is a fungal disease. So, and you don't want to get that confused because again, different management program for that disease. In the branches in the trunk, the symptoms you will see, they're going to be, again, facilitated by stress, whether it's a spring frost, blossom blast infection, winter freezes, severe winter freezes, pruning wounds, insect injuries. You'll see a sunken bark. You'll see gummosis here that can be oozing out. Limb death, tree death. You can also be predisposition to other cankers like cytospora, leucostoma canker. It looks really ugly. I mean, it just like when you have the disease, it looks pretty ugly in the trees. Now, as far as understanding when are the most susceptible times for this pathogen and for the disease to basically get a foothold in your orchard, remember, this is a cold weather pathogen. It is going to be at its best when there's cool, wet conditions. So when does that occur? Well, number one, early spring. So that's why this is a predisposition for blossom blast. You can get in, the bacteria is going to be overwintering all over the tree, and it can be coating the blossoms and the buds, and you can have a huge population. So if you have a frost event, basically you've got ripe conditions for blossom blast to occur. In the summer, it's hot and humid. The bacteria does not like these conditions. So the population is going to be very, very low, which is a good thing. Now with autumn, you have higher populations because it can be cool and wet during this time. And so this is during the time when you want to be managing the disease, because this is when you can get infection of the buds and such. So infection can be very high during this period because you have a high population of bacteria because the conditions favor it. And in the midwinter, it's a matter of, the bacteria is going to be overwintering in the tree. And if there's really severe temperatures and you get damage, that bacteria is going to take advantage of that. Again, it likes that cooler weather. So this is a busy slide. I apologize. This will be available so people will be able to take a snapshot or screen grab. But as far as bacterial canker management, it's challenging. And so copper by itself does not seem to do a good job. However, some folks determine that when you mix copper and lime and vegetable oil, it seems to help with managing the disease and doing it strategically. So Alan Biggs had done some of this work back in the 80s when he was in Canada, and Wynne Kogel has been promoting this, in several publications. It was in as far as in New Jersey back in 2012. It made the UMass Fruit Notes at some point. So those are links there to those two publications to give you more detail. But basically the gist is that you're doing this combination of Bordeaux plus vegetable oil during the late summer, early fall, and doing the successive application as you are going into the dormant period to knock back those bacterial populations. So basically it's, you're increasing your rate of copper and your lime, and then pretty much adding the same amount of oil. And the idea is that the oil supposedly adds a safener. I'm not sure how much that will help, but it definitely will help penetrate the tissue. And that's really what you want. In this case, you want the copper to be penetrating. And there was sort of like this, as far as a how-to to do it, is you want powdered copper sulfate, really fresh hydrated lime. So as far as mixing, you fill a tank half full with water, you add agitation, you're adding the copper, the lime, and then the oil to get everything all mixed in. So that's one option. Another option that came to my attention a few years ago is just doing one application of 10% lime sulfur, and that's in a volume to volume application. All you need to do is do one application in late September and early October, and then that's it. And actually, the warmer it is, the better off you are. So if it's in the 70s, that lime sulfur is going to cook whatever bacteria is there on the tree. And Drew Hubbard, who was at Oregon State, was doing this work. And so he's the one that mentioned this to me, that he had, because they really struggle with bacterial diseases on cherries in Oregon. And so he said, this is great. It doesn't really have any negative impacts to the tree. Yes, you will see defoliation, but it doesn't matter because it's late in the season, so it'll be just fine. So that's another option as opposed, as opposed to doing the copper. Because I know people get skittish about copper because putting a lot of copper out in the environment, potential going in the soil, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here's an alternative to that, is using 10% lime sulfur. Other management strategies, pruning. Well, you want to avoid large dormant cuts because remember the bacterial population is going to be at a good amount during the winter. You can minimize the impact of disease with summer pruning, and that's because the bacterial population is going to be at its lowest. Now, I know that folks may be hard pressed to do this, but triage. It's if you've had a history of bacterial canker in your orchard, focus on those trees that have had issues as far as for your summer pruning. And then when you do see bacterial canker, use that ugly stub method, much like you do with fire blight. In this case, you want to make sure you leave a sizable stub. And the other thing is just kind of, basic horticultural health, removing and preventing plant stressors, well-drained soils, adequate nutrients, weed control, removing wild prunus, because that can be a reservoir source. And the other thing is if you have an orchard that has a history of bacterial canker, be mindful of replants because your youngest trees are going to be really susceptible to that population that's in there, bacterial population. So just be mindful of if you're planting replants in your orchard, if you're, replacing them due to them dying due to bacterial canker.
Carrie?
Yes.
We have a few questions in the chat. One is just, can you please define dormant?
Dormant, I would say before bud break.
Okay.
That's dormant.
All right. That's
what I see dormant. If, in apples, I hear delayed dormant, which is if, say, you get a poke of a little bit of green tissue, you got to be mindful, like if you're putting on copper, you got to be mindful of how much green tissue is poking through, so if there's just a little bit of bud break, not a whole lot of green, you can probably get away with copper. But if you really get half-inch green or you see the bud, that would be an apple. If you really see a lot of green tissue, that's definitely not dormant. So, we throw around dormant or delayed dormant. I'd say dormant is before bud break, before bud swell.
Let's see. Another one was, can you explain the effect of winter pruning? When exactly are we talking?
This pathogen likes cold weather. So winter pruning, I would say, be any time when you've got really cold weather. So, you know, depending on now, I would say in the bowels depths of winter, you probably would be wanting to avoid pruning, you know, stone fruit trees that have a history of bacterial canker, even now. Like, so as far as the question, summer is the time you want to be pruning because that's when the bacterial population is low. Like right now, it is, you know, not that it's chilly out, it's cold nights. This is really ideal conditions for the bacterial pathogen. So if you have like a history, there is that idea that the bacteria could infect the wounds. And those wounds, when they're in this dormant period and the tree's not active, they heal over their wounds much slower. So that's another incentive of summer pruning, is that those pruning wounds will heal much faster in the summer, you know, so they won't become compromised by, you know, any bacteria. But even then, the bacterial population is going to be pretty low and not too happy during the summer because the conditions just don't favor it. All right, okay, here we go. So now we're switching to bacterial spot. So bacterial spot, in contrast to bacterial canker and blossom blast, this is a warm weather disease. It likes warm, humid conditions, really hot conditions, really humid conditions. If you've got basically 100% humidity over a few days, this disease really pops out. So just something to be mindful of. It's very opposite from the bacterial canker, which likes cold weather. So as far as symptoms, it all depends on the susceptibility of the cultivar. You've got some cultivars that will get infected before pit hardening. So that's the one on the left here, this picture. It's before pit hardening. And this is a plum in the inset. And so you will see, you know, these symptoms basically pop up really not much longer once the fruit get to be about like the size of a quarter almost, or maybe a bit bigger. And they're pitted in the fruit skin. In the case of plums, you see these depressed circular lesions that are cracked. That is all bacterial spot. Post pit hardening, you get the shallow cracks, or the shallow pitting, and that's what's on the right here on this nectarine. Shallow, as far as the shallow pits as evidence of bacterial spot on fruit. What's bad about both of these is that they can be an entry point for brown rot. And so they do compromise the skin, and fungal spores can get in there and you can get, you know, rotten fruit. And so, you know, I will say this is that having bacterial spot on the fruit isn't on automatic, like I throw this to the cull bin. I'm surprised as far as how much bacterial spot is actually pretty much, there's a lot of forgivable bacterial spot incidents out there. Definitely the one on the left wouldn't be good, but on the right, you know, it's probably pushing the limits. But I've seen a lot of markets with bacterial spot on the fruit, and it doesn't seem to bother the consumers much. But you know, that's just to sort of let you know as far as bacterial spot infection can occur at different times. Now, it's important to know the difference between peach scab and bacterial spot. Again, two different pathogens, one's bacteria, one's fungal. Now, on bacterial spot, these are pitted lesions. Peach scab, these are small olive green lesions on the fruit. And you see them on the fruit only. You also see them on the twigs, never on the leaves. There's no foliar symptoms. You'll see foliar symptoms with bacterial spot. And so for folks who see peach scab, it's just something to be mindful of, to know the difference between the two of these diseases. Because again, one's fungal, one's bacterial, and they both require different management strategies. Now, as far as seeing early disease symptoms and being mindful of that. So this was in late May of 2014. So I circled here and I saw spots. Now, if you see spots on the leaves, you want to ask yourself, what are the shapes of those spots? Are they angular? Do they follow the veins? If they do, that is early bacterial spot. They may be light green and water soaked. That's bacterial spot. So this is an early stage of the disease. This is a later stage, as far as this was later, you know, a few weeks later. And the leaf will turn yellow around those areas where you see the spots. Again, you can see they're angular. They follow the veins. And then you can actually, if I pulled off that leaf and held it up to the light, I could actually start to see early symptoms showing too, just by looking at the veins of the leaf. So again, if you see spots on your leaves, ask yourself, are they angular? Are they defined by the veins? And you know it's definitely bacterial spot. So the trouble with bacterial spot is that basically it's polycyclic, meaning you get infection over and over and over again throughout the season. So the bacteria overwinters in the wood and the buds and the twigs, and then you get the ripe conditions, and then you've got bacteria basically flying through the trees, for lack of a better phrase. It likes warm conditions. When it's hot and dry, the disease slows down, and I can attest to that. Last year for us, bacterial spot wasn't a tragic disease. It was there. It kind of was a pain, but it was a low incidence disease, low incidence season overall, because we just did not have any rain. It was just hot all summer, and it was dry, very few rain events. But if it was hot and wet, then it's going to be a bad bacterial spot. So again, this is a polycyclic disease, and unfortunately, if you leave the disease untreated, the bacterial populations are going to explode within the trees. As far as bacterial spot management goes, well, the first thing that's going to help is during the dormant period is to apply a dormant copper spray. So, you know, this is going to help with a lot of diseases, you know, your dormant copper sprays. And so the rate you want to aim for is 2 pounds to the acre of metallic copper. Remember that metallic phrase? And the other thing you want to be doing is removing any dead cankers or dead wood, you know, in your trees as well. So again, metallic copper. So I did a screenshot of the labels here. You want to be looking at that metallic copper information that I discussed a little bit earlier. So in this case here, for coside, the equivalent is 30%. So that means there's 0.3 pounds of copper, metallic copper, per pound of coside. So if I want to be applying about 2 pounds of metallic copper using coside, I'm going to be applying about 6 pounds of copper to reach, or 6 pounds of coside to reach my 2 pound metallic rate, 2 pounds of the acre metallic rate. So just as, you know, when we're throwing out as a rate, metallic copper rate to aim for, you want to be looking on the label of the copper that you're using. Okay, so this is a busy slide and I'm going to walk you through it. So seasonal, so we talked about dormant applications. So let's talk about seasonal copper applications. So this comes from Norma Lancet at Rutgers. And let me walk you through this table here. So we've got on the left here, the product name of all the different copper products, the formulation, or basically the metallic copper formulation, how it's presented in the product, the active ingredient. These first two products have a 0-day PHI, the reentry level. The other products have a 21-day PHI and different reentry level, and the pre-harvest interval. So as you can see, there's a few coppers with 0 days. I just mentioned the rest are usually 21 days. For post-bloom application, this is the rate that's labeled, that's on the label. However, that's not what you're going to be focusing on. What you're going to be focusing on is really two rates based on that metallic copper rate. The first rate is using 0.5%, 0.5% of metallic copper. We call this the 1X rate. And so this is what the 0.5% metallic copper is. So in coside, you're using 1.7 ounces of coside during your season. That's the rate you want to go at. You'll get some phytotoxicity, but not bad. What that phytotoxicity tells you is that it's working, the copper's working. And peach and nectarine trees, they can take a little bit of a beating and still be okay. You just don't want to make Christmas trees out of them, okay? Now, perhaps you're not satisfied with that disease control. Well, you can double that rate to the 2X rate. And what that is that you're going to be doubling the amount. So in the case of coside, it would be 3.4 ounces to the acre you're applying during your season. And that's usually the rate I always pick, is that 2X rate. Now for Quava, it's 25 fluid ounces. If you want the 2X rate, it would be 50 fluid ounces. Nordox, the 1X rate, or the 0.5% metallic rate, would be 0.7. If you want a little bit more control, it would be 1.4, etc. So this, Norm did all the calculations, and back in the day, I wanted to sort of take all the different coppers and do this, but that takes some time and math, and I didn't have the time. But it's very easy to do the calculation. So if you have a copper that you like, let me know and I can kind of help you walk you through as far as get to the right rate. But again, the rate you want to aim for is either the 0.5% or the 1% rate. So basically what those rates do is that you'll get disease control with the minimum amount of phytotoxicity. You'll still get phyto, but it's not going to be a death sentence for the tree, okay? So as you can see in many of these cases, it is significantly less than what the label says, okay? So this is how we use the copper smartly, is that, you know, using it at a certain metallic rate, which is a 0.5% or at 1%. And it's important to monitor your trees when you're using especially the higher rate, because maybe you see it's a sensitive cultivar and it's just getting, you know, the leaves are falling a little too much. Then you'd want to back off. But it's just something to be mindful of when you're using in different copper products. Is really the label is a guide, but that you want to be focusing on at these reduced rates in many of these cases, especially for something like new cop, which the post bloom rate is 1 to 3 pounds. And really the rate you want to be using is 1 ounce, you know, for the 1X rate. Okay. And so I have all the different coppers that are labeled for peaches and nectarines in our tree fruit production guide, which I adapted from Michigan's guide. So, and again, as I mentioned, I will send Jeremy that as far as the file for that table. So at least you guys have it and he can get it out to wherever you guys put your stuff at. So fortunately, I did not do the math to do this, but I can help folks if they have problems because I've done a lot of these calculations. Okay, so this should answer as far as the questions about what rate of COSI, what rate of this, what rate of that. This is the rate I'm following for bacterial spot. Is this 1X or 2X rate? Okay. Okay, as far as other how to focus on bacterial spot programs. So you want to start at shuck split for bacterial spot. And this always seems to work out pretty well. The conditions really aren't favorable, at least in our area, aren't really favorable by bacterial spot prior to shuck split. And you usually want to go to about 3 weeks before harvest. And then you focus on brown rot during those 3 weeks. So copper, you can use it at the 5.5 ounce metallic copper rate or the 1 ounce metallic copper rate. So 0.5% or the 1% rate, and rotate it with other products. So if you're really concerned about as far as copper load and, you know, copper injury, you know, and also if it's really wet conditions, you know, during that time, you want to be minimizing copper usage. I've seen very good luck with Serenade ASO at 4 quarts to the acre, or Serenade Opti at 14 ounces to the acre, or Double Nickel at 2 quarts to the acre, rotating with copper and also oxytetracycline. So you do need a very, as far as a rotational management program, and it seems to kind of do a pretty decent job as far as keeping things in check. You know, in some cases, I mean, you could use, you know, you could use a 2-way rotation, you can use a 3-way rotation, it's up to you, but these are other options. And if disease conditions persist, you need to keep your spray intervals tight. So in some cases, you might be spraying on a weekly basis, which is a real pain. But, you know, disease conditions, if you have susceptible varieties and a high incidence of bacterial spot, you know, it will pay off. Rampart and Prophyte and subsequent products that are in that family, I've not observed any use, or I should say any efficacy with those. Regalia, I forgot to mention, I've seen phytotoxicity with Regalia that does drop leaves. So I'm taking it off of my recommendation list because of that, because I've tested that several years in a row and I'm a little concerned by the phyto issues. It's just as bad as copper, and I'm not sure if I'm getting any disease control with it. So just an FYI in that. Now, if you don't have any crop due to winter injury or some frost freeze event that wiped out your fruit, you still need to control for bacterial spot. It's on the leaves. You don't want the disease to build up. So just a quick reminder about that. Now, last thing that I want to focus on is understanding the difference between copper injury and bacterial spot. If you are awake for any part of this talk, be awake for this part, okay? Because this will save you some heartache if you see issues in the orchard and you may not know what's going on and you may overcompensate. Next thing you know, you've got peach trees that look like Christmas trees with no leaves on it, okay? So knowing the difference, okay? So here's a side-by-side pictures of leaves that show bacterial spot on the left, copper injury on the right. So bacterial spot, the lesions are always angular. So as I tell people, as far as a mnemonic, the A in bacteria, the A in angular, okay? The lesions are always bordered by the veins. It seems a bacteria-like sort of kind of settling in those veins. You may have a few lesions or you may have a lot of lesions. It doesn't take many lesions to cause yellowing on the leaf and for the leaf to fall off. Okay, so just as far as, again, you could see some shot hole appearances, but the leaves typically always turn yellow and they will fall off. Now, copper injury or captan injury or, other chemical injury, the pattern in the leaves is very irregular. The leaves are always round. They're different sizes of round. And remember, here's your mnemonic, the O in copper, the O in round. Okay, when you're looking at the spots on the leaf, it looks like Swiss cheese. You can have a lot of holes in that leaf and the leaf will still stay on the branch. Okay, that's kind of in contrast to bacterial spot, where those leaves will always fall off once the disease progresses with the leaves. The defoliation really will give the tree a beating. Where you'll see as far as a lot of holes is on those oldest leaves of the tree branch, which that's not the case with bacterial spot. You can see them on any age of the leaves. So in the case of copper injury, you'll see them on the older leaves. Captan and sulfur injury will appear similar, okay? Yellowing, as I mentioned, not always associated with copper injury. Yes, you can get some defoliation, but it's not like bacterial spot, and it's primarily the older leaves. Basically, if you see a shoot branch and you see the oldest leaves naked, that's usually due to buildup of copper, okay? So again, just as a reminder, mnemonic here, angular lesions, the A in angular, the A in bacteria, copper injury, circular lesions, round lesions, the O in round, the O in copper, okay? Okay, so it's finally kind of wrapping things up with the do's and don'ts of copper, and it's also with bacterial spot control in particular. So just remember that the solubility of fixed coppers increases under acidic conditions. Copper is going to become more phytotoxic, as in damaging the leaves in acidic conditions. Ironically, it's the phytotoxicity on the leaves, not so much on the fruit with stone fruit trees. It's just kind of a reminder there. Make sure you check the pH of your spray water. Again, re-emphasizing the acidic solutions. Beware of adjuvants, and don't mix copper products with anything that penetrates the leaves really well, like foliar fertilizers or some of these phosphorus acid products. Slow drying conditions, just be careful what you're applying in the conditions when you've got frequent rain events. The cover sprays for peaches and nectarines, adjust it to that 0.5 ounces or 0.5% to 1 ounce or 1% to the acre of metallic copper. So that is those are decent rates. And again, the higher the rate you go, the more control you'll get of bacterial spot on your peach, but the more phytotoxicity you'll get too. So this is the sweet spot that Norm figured out. And again, to limit phytotoxicity, you can rotate your copper with other products like their Serenade and oxytetracycline. Okay, so again, and just as a reminder, you may hear from other folks say down south that Serenade and double nickel don't work. That's down south where their disease conditions are on steroids. We don't get those disease conditions. And that's why I believe I see these products do offer efficacy, because the disease conditions can be tempered with other products and they can be used in a rotational program. Okay, this is just a reminder, just to make sure that you control for disease on your stone fruit trees if they don't have a crop, because there are a lot of diseases out there that really don't need fruit. Brown rot is really the only disease you don't have to worry about, but you need to be worrying about other diseases, so foliar diseases that and twig diseases like peach scab. So you can be conservative during this time period as far as controlling, but this is just as a reminder. God forbid we have a season where we lose our crop, but just as a reminder, it's not to rest on your laurels and forget about it. You still need to control for disease.
So Carrie, have you caught your breath to be able to take a few questions?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Well, the first one comes in, it's asking about, is there any increased risk of SWD injury when we have bacterial spot damage? Have you seen that at all?
No, I haven't, but
Okay.
that's not to say that yeah, I haven't noticed it. I've noticed it more in cherries than in peaches. And then I've noticed like stink bug issues too, more like when the population, brown marmorated stink bug, when the issue becomes more problematic as the season wears on. So.
And we've definitely seen it at times when if we get fruit splitting or something like that, we see SWD show up. And
well, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
I may have not observed the conditions for it. So and
okay.
that's entomology, folks. I sort of like half an ear with that.
Yeah.
But that's a good question though. That's a good question.
Focused on other things out there.
Yeah.
We had a question.
So much.
We did have a question about the material. Have you ever tried the material Time Guard?
Yes, I have. And I have not seen it work on Bacterial Spot. So I've heard other stories, but I have not used it. I haven't. I've looked at it by itself, and maybe it would work better in a rotational program, because what I've noticed with these softer products is like by itself, they really buckle under the disease pressure. But if you decrease the disease pressure somehow, whether it's timing it or using other products that lessen the disease load, it might work better. So I've never used Time Guard in a rotational program that would lessen the disease pressure through other products. So maybe that's where it might work, but by itself, it was weak for me, at least.
Okay.
So if you that's sort of my stance on, not that I won't, maybe this year I kind of have a list of things I want to try. And maybe that's what I'll try this year is Time Guard in a rotation program to see how it would work.
Excellent. Okay. We had another one. At what level does pH become a problem that would cause or contribute to phytotoxicity?
Well, it doesn't seem to take much. Like I said, the Quava and Coside comparison there. So Quava was at 6.52 and Coside was at 7.52. And just that like sort of 1 degree or 1 point of separation, I saw differences in the orchard. So, definitely, it seems that the more neutral you are, the less the phytotoxicity, you'll still get phytotoxicity, but it doesn't seem to be overwhelming. And the other thing I will have to mention that I was using also Quava at a slightly higher rate. I was using it close to the same metallic rate, but just slightly higher. But, so it's just something to be mindful of. You don't want your pH at 5 with your copper. It's going to be bad. But I would say if it's more, it seems that when your water is more neutral, things will stay more neutral. But in some of these, and you also be mindful, in some of these liquid solutions where the solution's already liquid, like Quava, there's a reason why it's liquid. So the solution's probably already a little acidic in order to maintain the solution to be liquid, or the majority of the product to be in a liquid form. So just something to keep in mind as far as the coppers that you're using.
Okay. All right, we've got several questions here. So let's see. We have one that says, what rate of oil for dormant copper application? And would this work for peach leaf curl as well?
Fungicides are better for Xyram is really good for chlorothalonil is really good for peach leaf curl. Copper seems to be on the weaker side for peach leaf curl. For the oil, it's whatever rate you would be using to control insects during the dormant period. So
Okay.
that I don't know off the top of my head. So it's whatever rate of oil you would typically use to control, those certain insects that can be controlled during the dormant period. So I would say for peach leaf curl, what I've noticed is that copper is definitely weaker, and you'll need multiple dormant applications to deal with peach leaf curl. And so I think you're better off using a straight fungicide like Xyram or chlorothalonil for controlling peach leaf curl, if you definitely have a problem.
Excellent. All right. This next one reads, you spoke about bacterial spot versus peach scab, but what about treatment for peach scab? Is copper not effective?
Okay. What I've noticed with copper and fungal diseases is that it depends on the fungal disease, and you're better off with copper can be a fungicide, but I think you're better off with straight fungicides for peach scab. And I can't remember, I can send Jeremy, I don't remember this off the top of my head because I don't encounter peach scab terribly often, if at all, in Pennsylvania where I'm located, but I do have the information stored in my brain, but I can't access it at the moment. There are key times to control for peach scab, and you usually can get away with captan and sulfur to control peach scab. Dormant applications definitely help, as far as knock things back. But as far as using copper to control peach scab, I think it's on the weaker side to control peach scab.
Okay. All right. We're getting close to time, but I do have a couple more questions if you're still game, Carrie.
Yep. While I'm here, I'm good.
Okay. All right. This one, should leaves be off for fall lime spray?
Well, define fall lime spray. What are we talking about? Are you talking about the lime sulfur spray? Is this
I think so. I think that's what they're referring to.
So no, they don't have to be off the tree. So if this is the question related to bacterial canker, controlling bacterial canker with that 10% lime sulfur, no, the leaves don't have to be off the trees. I asked Drew this and he said, nope, they don't need to be off the trees. It really doesn't matter. And now if you don't have time and you miss it, it's still fine. I mean, you get your lime sulfur on the tree, it's still going to do what it needs to do. But no, the answer is no, you don't have to have the leaves off the tree.
Okay. All right. And then the next one we have is, what is the fate of copper in the soil? Is this a problem?
That's a good question. I mean, that's something that's always at the forefront of my mind with regards to using copper as a disease management tool. This is where it's a blessing and a curse. I don't have the answer for that because I haven't done the research. But it would be interesting to team up with someone who does look at that to see, especially in areas where copper has been used regularly, to control bacterial diseases. So I know products like copper soap, the copper octanoate or quava, its claim to fame is that it can break down so it doesn't persist in the soil. That's one of its selling points on the company's website. That's a really good question, and that's one reason why I want to make sure that people have options of other products to copper to control for bacterial spot, is to sort of try to lessen some of that load that could go into the soil. So, but it's a good question, and it's always on my mind.
Okay, and then Carrie, the last question that we had was really about peach leaf curl that keeps popping up in the chat, and timing for chlorothalonil to control peach leaf curl in the dormant period.
So, with peach leaf curl, the only way to control peach leaf curl is when all the leaves are off the trees, okay? Because the fungus lives in the buds. And once you once the buds swell and once the leaves emerge, there's nothing you can do. Okay, so you want to make sure you do it sometime during the dormant period and before buds swell. That's really important, because there have been some years here in Pennsylvania where we have had like 80-degree warm-ups in February, and that's been enough to push some of the early varieties, and the grower put on their fungicide or their peach leaf curl spray, and it was 100% ineffective because the buds had already swelled enough to protect those fungal spores. And so peach leaf curl was really bad that year. So I always try to remind the growers that, you know, especially now, and we had some crazy warm-ups recently, like 75 degrees for 2 days in a row. You definitely want to make sure that your fungicide spray for peach leaf curl is, you know, some before that bud swell. So it's before bud swell. That's usually my line, is before bud swell. And I'm laughing because I see the next question about.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to make sure that got out.
I apologize. I didn't mean to laugh, but I saw that and that made,
so
made my day. So
we'll be looking for the merchandise for Dr. Treefruit to come out.
Yeah,
sometime soon.
I'll work on that.
Okay. Lots of comments saying what a great presentation this was today. So thank you again.
You. I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, great having you, Carrie, and great having you, Liza. Thank you both for being here. Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.